Welcome, everyone, to the very first episode of Conspiracy Files, right here on the Beyond the Known podcast.
It's great to be kicking this off.
Absolutely. Today, we're diving deep into a really big one, a topic that's, well, it's fascinated and divided people for decades now, the moonlanding conspiracy.
That's right. And for this episode, we're going to really explore the main arguments, the core claims made by those who believe the 1969 moon landing was essentially a fabrication.
Okay.
So we'll present these theories first, kind of from the viewpoint of a believer, based on our research, laying out what they see as the evidence.
Right, putting ourselves in those shoes first. So, okay, let's unpack this. If you talk to someone who thinks it was faked, one of the first things visually is that American flag. They always ask, how can it look like it's waving? There's no air, no atmosphere on the moon, so no wind. What's making it wave?
It's a really powerful image, isn't it? And yet it immediately makes you question things if you don't know the context. Why would a flag flutter up there?
Exactly. And then, sticking with the photos, there's this guy.
Yes, the stars, or lack thereof.
Right. You look at these pictures taken on the moon, and the sky is just black, totally empty, no stars. And for a believer, shouldn't space just be teeming with stars? An amazing view.
It feels wrong intuitively. We picture space, we picture stars, and so the question is, well, where did they go in the photos?
This does seem odd at first glance. Okay, moving on, still with the photos, another big point is about the shadows.
The inconsistent shadows, yeah.
People who doubt the landings, they often point to pictures where shadows from different objects, they don't look parallel. And the argument is, well, that suggests more than one light source, right? Like the studio lights on a film set, not just the single, very distant sun.
Right. And that, for them, points directly to it being staged. Because light and shadow, they follow basic rules. These photos seem to break those rules.
It's a key piece of their visual analysis. And this one's interesting. Think about the lunar module actually landing. Conspiracy theorists often focus on the ground underneath it. They ask, where's the big blast crater? Or even like a major disturbance and all that fine lunar dust.
Yeah, you'd expect a powerful rocket engine to kick up a lot of fuss, maybe even carve out a hole.
That's the expectation. So the fact that it looks relatively undisturbed underneath, that seems really suspicious to them.
It definitely challenges that mental image of a rocket landing. That lack of visual evidence or perceived lack is really central.
Okay, another visual point, the way the astronauts move.
The slow motion effect.
Yeah. To a believer, it looks, kind of floaty, strangely slow, almost artificial. And the theory they propose is that, well, maybe this was just filmed with actors in a studio, walking normally, and then they just slowed the footage down afterwards.
Right, slowed it down to mimic what they thought low gravity would look like. It's an attempt to explain those distinct movements using familiar Earth-based techniques.
Makes sense if you start from that assumption. Now, what about the journey to the moon? This one comes up a lot.
The Van Allen belts.
Exactly, the radiation. A skeptic might ask, how on earth could the astronauts have survived flying through those intense radiation belts?
Yeah.
They argue the spacecraft, the shielding, it just couldn't possibly have been enough to protect them from lethal doses of radiation.
Those belts sound incredibly dangerous, like a real barrier in space.
Okay.
So asking how they got through safely is, well, it's a very common question for skeptics.
It sounds like a huge obstacle. And then there's this idea of missing evidence.
The lost tapes.
Yeah, the missing original tapes, the original data, Apollo 11. The claim is that these crucial recordings, maybe telemetry data too, they've either been lost or, worse, intentionally erased.
And for a believer, that immediately signals a cover-up, right? If the evidence is gone, it must be because it showed something they didn't want us to see.
Lost evidence always fuels suspicion. It suggests something important is being hidden.
Definitely.
Now, this is an interesting cultural link our research picked up on, the movie Capricorn.
Oh, yeah, the 1978 film about a fake Mars landing.
Right. And conspiracy theorists often point to it, saying, look how similar the plot is to what we think happened with the moon landing. They suggest it's maybe not just a coincidence. Maybe it reflects some kind of insider knowledge. Or perhaps it just shows the idea was already out there.
The parallels are definitely noticeable, and it certainly resonates if you're already leaning towards skepticism about Apollo. It feeds that narrative.
And then there's probably the most famous Hollywood connection, the Stanley Kubrick theory.
Ah, yes, the idea that the acclaimed director secretly filmed it all for NASA.
Exactly. He was known for his meticulous detail, his visual genius in 2001, A Space Odyssey. Some theories propose he was hired to stage the whole thing.
And some even look for clues, supposed hints or confessions hidden in his later films like The Shining.
Yeah, it adds this layer of cinematic intrigue to the whole thing. A master illusionist involved in the ultimate illusion.
It's quite a compelling narrative thread for some.
Okay, here's a more geopolitical point that often gets raised about the Soviets.
Right, America's big rival in the space race.
The claim, or at least it was claimed initially, was that the Soviet Union didn't actually have the technology, the capability to track deep space missions accurately until about 1972.
Okay.
Which, if true, would mean that back in 1969, they couldn't have independently verified if Apollo 11 actually went to the moon, making a hoax easier to pull off.
So if your main competitor couldn't check your work, so to speak, who could? That's the implication. It questions the verification aspect.
So why? Why would they do all this? What's the grand motivation for faking it?
Well, the context of the Cold War is key here.
Right. Believers often argue the U.S. government needed a massive win, a huge propaganda victory.
Exactly. Maybe to distract the American public from the very unpopular Vietnam War.
And, of course, to decisively win the space race against the Soviets, to claim that ultimate prize in front of the whole world.
The geopolitical stakes were incredibly high. A successful moon landing offered a huge boost to American prestige and technological superiority. It's a powerful motive.
It certainly provides a why. And then there's this lingering question, one many people still ask today, actually.
Why haven't we been back?
Exactly. If we went in 1969 and several times after, why haven't humans walked on the moon in, over 50 years now? For a conspiracy theorist, this long gap, this absence, it strongly suggests maybe we couldn't really do it back then. Maybe the capability wasn't truly there.
That lack of follow-up missions for such a long time, it definitely fuels skepticism. It makes people wonder about the original achievement.
It's a persistent question. And finally, some theorists look at the astronauts themselves.
Their behavior afterwards?
Yeah. They claim the Apollo astronauts sometimes acted, suspiciously after their missions. Maybe avoiding public events or giving interviews where they seemed, evasive or uncomfortable.
Right, interpreting certain reactions or statements, maybe even perceived silences, as signs they were carrying the burden of a massive secret. Hiding a lie?
The human element. Scrutinizing how they acted under pressure.
Exactly. Looking for cracks in the story through the individuals involved.
Okay, so we've laid out, based on our research, the main arguments, the key pieces of evidence from the perspective of someone who genuinely believes the moon landing was a hoax.
Right. We've tried to present their case fairly. Now it's time to switch gears.
Okay.
Let's look at the detailed debunking evidence. What science, history, and expert analysis tell us about each of these claims?
All right. Let's tackle them one by one, starting back with that waving flag.
The flag, okay. So our research confirms it wasn't waving because of wind. That's correct. There's no wind.
So what was making it look like that?
It was mounted on a special pole. It was telescopic, but it also had a horizontal bar along the top edge extending outwards.
Like holding it out straight.
Exactly. NASA designed it that way specifically so the flag wouldn't just hang limp in the vacuum. They wanted it displayed properly.
Okay, so the pole held it out. What about the ripples, the wave?
Well, two things. First, the flag was folded up really tightly for the journey. So those ripples you see are mostly just creases from being packed away. They never fully smoothed out.
Like a shirt you just unfolded.
Pretty much. And second, when the astronauts were planting the pole, twisting it into the ground, they disturbed it. They set it in motion.
Okay.
In a vacuum, with no air resistance to dampen the movement, it would swing back and forth for a little while, like a pendulum, just from the momentum they give it. Videos actually show it moving and then becoming completely still.
Right, because there's nothing to keep it fluttering.
Okay.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the missing stars, then? That still seems weird visually.
It does until you understand the photography involved.
Mm-hmm.
The lunar surface, lit by the direct, unfiltered sun, was incredibly bright. Super bright.
Brighter than daylight on Earth.
Oh, yeah. No atmosphere scattering the light. So to take a decent picture of the astronauts and the lunar module, things that were also brightly lit, the cameras needed very specific settings. Fast shutter speeds, small aperture. Basically, settings designed to let in less light to avoid overexposing the main subject.
Okay.
But distant stars are incredibly faint points of light. Those camera settings, optimized for the bright foreground, simply weren't sensitive enough to capture that faint starlight.
So it's like trying to take a picture of stars during the daytime here on Earth. You wouldn't see them either.
Exactly the same principle. The bright subject washes out the faint ones. It's just basic photography, not a conspiracy.
Got it. Okay, what about those non-parallel shadows? The ones suggesting multiple lights?
This one's about perspective and terrain. The moon's surface isn't perfectly flat, right? It's uneven, with craters, slopes, undulations.
Sure.
When you have a single distant light source like the sun casting shadows across an uneven landscape, perspective can make those shadows appear non-parallel in a 2D photograph.
How does that work?
Think about standing on a hill looking down at railway tracks receding into the distance. They are parallel, but they look like they converge, right?
Yeah, perspective.
It's similar with shadows on uneven ground. Depending on the slope of the ground the shadow falls on and your viewing angle, shadows that are actually parallel in 3D space can look like they're pointing in slightly different directions in the photo. Especially when the sun is low, casting long shadows. Scientists have replicated this effect easily on Earth using a single light source on uneven terrain.
So it's an optical illusion caused by the bumpy ground and the camera angle.
Precisely, not evidence of studio lighting.
Okay. Now, the lack of a big blast crater under the lander.
Right. Well, the lunar module's descent engine wasn't like a Saturn V liftoff rocket. It was designed for a controlled, relatively gentle landing in a vacuum.
So less power.
Different kind of power delivery. Its thrust was more spread out, designed to counteract the moon's gravity precisely and slow the descent, not to blast a huge hole. Also, the lunar soil, the regolith, is actually quite densely packed beneath a fine layer of dust.
So it wouldn't displace easily.
Not like loose sand, no. But it's also incorrect to say there was no disturbance. Photos from the site, and especially photos taken later by orbiting spacecraft like the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, clearly show disturbed soil around the landing legs and the area directly beneath the engine nozzle. You can see patterns from the exhaust.
So there is evidence of the landing burn, just not a Hollywood-style crater.
Exactly. The physics of landing in a vacuum with that specific engine match what we see.
And the slow-motion astronauts, was the footage doctored?
No need. The movements look slow because of the moon's gravity. It's only about 1/6 of Earth's gravity. Which means everything falls slower. When you jump, you go higher and stay up longer. Your steps have a different rhythm. The way dust kicks up and falls back down, it all happens more slowly, more floatily.
So what we see is actually real physics in action.
Absolutely. The astronauts' movements, the way they hop or bound along, the arc of tossed objects, it's all perfectly consistent with moving in 1/6 G. Trying to fake that by just slowing film would actually look wrong in subtle ways, like the speed of arm movements versus leg movements.
Okay, so the low gravity explains the movement. What about surviving the Van Allen belts? That radiation sounds serious.
It is serious radiation, but the danger depends on the dose, which depends on intensity and time. The Apollo missions didn't hang around in the belts.
How fast did they go through?
They transited the most intense inner belt in a matter of minutes, and the wider, less intense outer belts in maybe an hour and a half or so total. NASA chose trajectories specifically to minimize this exposure time.
And the spacecraft itself offered protection.
Yes, the aluminum hull of the command module and service module provided significant shielding. It wasn't perfect, but it reduced the dose considerably.
So the total dose wasn't lethal.
Not even close. Experts, including Dr. James Van Allen himself, the discoverer of the belts, calculated the doses. The astronauts received a dose comparable to what nuclear energy workers might get over a year, or what space shuttle astronauts received in Earth orbit over longer missions. It was well within acceptable limits for the time.
Okay, so fast transit, specific trajectory, and shielding. That covers the radiation. Now, those missing tapes sounds bad.
It does sound bad, but the story is, well, more about poor archiving and budget cuts in the years after Apollo.
So they were lost or reused.
Some original telemetry tapes, yes, were overwritten or reused. This was apparently a common practice at NASA and other government agencies at the time to save money on expensive magnetic tapes. It's seen as a significant historical loss now, but not necessarily a sign of a cover-up.
But isn't that the only record?
Oh, absolutely not. Vast amounts of data do exist. We have the voice transcripts, the medical telemetry that was recorded separately, tons of photographs, all the film footage. Plus, crucially, tracking stations all over the world run by different countries and even independent observers tracked the Apollo spacecraft on their journey to the moon and back. They picked up the radio transmissions.
So there was independent verification.
Lots of it. The idea that erasing a few specific data tapes could hide the entire mission just doesn't hold up when you consider all the other existing evidence and independent tracking.
Okay. And the link to Capricorn 1. just a movie.
Pretty much. It's a fictional film that came out in 1978, almost a decade after Apollo 11. It definitely tapped into and maybe even fueled public skepticism that already existed to some degree. But it's not evidence for a hoax. It's fiction reflecting, or perhaps exploiting, a cultural anxiety. You can't use a movie plot as proof something actually happened.
Right, correlation isn't causation there. What about the Stanley Kubrick theory? Any truth to that?
Zero credible evidence supports it. Our research shows Kubrick was busy making 2001: A Space Odyssey before the 1969 landing. While his effects were amazing for film, the technology needed to realistically fake hours of live moon footage, interacting with the environment, driving the rover later on. It just didn't exist in the late 60s, not even for Kubrick.
And the clues in The Shining.
Those are purely interpretations by viewers. Finding patterns after the fact, there's no confirmation from Kubrick or anyone involved. And that supposed confession video, it's been widely debunked. It features an actor, not Kubrick. It's simply not a credible theory based on facts.
Okay, that seems pretty clear-cut. What about the Soviet tracking? Could they actually track Apollo 11?
Yes, absolutely. The idea they couldn't track deep space missions until 1972 is incorrect. The Soviets had their own successful uncrewed lunar program running since the late 50s, Luna missions, and had sophisticated deep space tracking networks to support it.
So they knew the U.S. was going.
They were tracking Apollo 11 closely. And importantly, the Soviet government and media acknowledged the American moon landing at the time. It was reported in Pravda, mentioned in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. If anyone had the motive and the means to expose a U.S. hoax, it was the Soviet Union, and they didn't. Their own crewed lunar program efforts faded after Apollo succeeded.
That's a very strong counterargument. Okay, so the motivation distracting from Vietnam winning the space race. Does the timeline fit?
Not perfectly. While the PR victory was huge, NASA's budget actually peaked years before the landing, around 1966. By the time of the later Apollo missions, funding was already being cut significantly. Apollo 17 in 1972 was the last one, largely due to these budget cuts and shifting priorities towards the space shuttle, not because the Vietnam War ended. The timing doesn't suggest it was purely a distraction tactic that stopped when the war did.
So the program wound down because of money and changing goals, not a conspiracy ending.
That's what the historical budget records and policy decisions indicate.
Which leads to the next point. Why haven't we been back with humans?
Again, it mostly comes down to cost and political will. Going to the moon is incredibly expensive. After winning the space race, the political urgency faded. NASA's focus shifted to reusable spacecraft, the shuttle, Earth orbit, Skylab ISS, and highly successful robotic exploration of the entire solar system.
So it wasn't a lack of ability.
No, it was a change in priorities. There wasn't a compelling scientific or political reason funded to justify the enormous expense of more crewed moon missions for decades. That's changing now, with the Artemis program aiming to return humans to the moon, showing that it requires renewed political will and massive funding.
Right, it takes more than just knowing how.
Yeah.
And finally, the astronauts acting guilty.
This is very subjective. These men went through an experience unlike any other in human history, and then faced intense global fame and scrutiny.
Yeah, that must have been immense pressure.
Exactly. Attributing any perceived awkwardness, clipped answers in interviews years later, or desire for privacy to guilt over a hoax seems like a huge leap. People react to intense experiences and media pressure differently. Simple things like memory recall changing over decades or just being tired of answering the same questions are far more likely explanations than a vast conspiracy. Their post-flight press conferences and interviews are extensively documented.
Okay, so we've gone through the main conspiracy points and the evidence-based counter-arguments from our research.
Yes, and stepping back, you see how each specific claim, when examined with scientific principles or historical context, has a rational explanation that doesn't involve a hoax.
This whole deep dive really shows that interplay, doesn't it? Skepticism, sometimes fueled by compelling-sounding arguments, versus the verifiable facts gathered over decades.
It does, and while those conspiracy theories raise questions that might seem plausible on the surface, our research shows the scientific, historical, and physical evidence supporting the reality of the Apollo missions is just overwhelming.
It's understandable why people question extraordinary events, that desire for alternative explanations. But critical thinking, checking multiple credible sources, looking for actual evidence, that seems crucial here.
Absolutely essential. And you have to consider the sheer scale. Hundreds of thousands of people worked on Apollo across the U.S. and internationally. Engineers, technicians, scientists, administrators.
keeping that many people silent for over 50 years, but something that big.
It beggars belief, honestly. The chances of a secret that vast holding without a single credible whistleblower, without leaked documents, it's practically zero.
Plus, as we mentioned, the independent tracking from other countries, including the rival Soviets.
And the physical evidence brought back nearly 400 kilograms of moon rocks.
Right, which have been studied by scientists worldwide and confirmed to be unique, definitely not from Earth. Their composition, isotope ratios, the micrometeorite impacts.
Exactly. And then there's the evidence still on the moon. Modern orbiters like NASA's LRO, India's Chandrayaan, Japan's Kaguya, they've taken high-resolution photos of the landing sites.
And you can actually see the lander descent stages.
You can see the descent stages, the rovers, the tracks left by the astronauts and rovers, even the shadows cast by the flags still standing in some cases. It's photographic proof from independent later missions.
And those laser reflectors.
The lunar laser-ranging retroreflectors, yes, left by Apollo 11, 14, and 15. Observatories on Earth bounce lasers off them to this day to measure the Earth-Moon distance with incredible precision. They are functioning pieces of Apollo hardware still working on the moon.
That's pretty hard evidence to refute.
It is. It's tangible, ongoing proof.
Well, this first episode of Conspiracy Files has certainly been illuminating. Exploring both sides of the moon landing debate really highlights the importance of evidence.
Indeed. We hope this encourages you, our listeners, to keep questioning, keep exploring, but always to be critical consumers of information. Seek out the evidence.
Remain curious, but critical. That's a great takeaway. Constantly seek that deeper understanding.
The universe is full of genuine mysteries, after all.
Thank you so much for joining us on Beyond the Known for this deep dive. If you enjoyed our look into the moon landing conspiracy, please do like, follow, and subscribe.
We'll be back with more explorations into fascinating conspiracies and the facts behind them. See you next time.